Today's backdrop builds on two prior backdrop videos I did, one on the greatest educational story never told, and then the other one on the science of reading. This is a little arcane, and yet I think it's really important for people to understand. 2 years ago, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction updated their English language arts standards, which I think they do every 7 or 8 or 9 years. And they made some changes to the beginning reading standards, which I think are going to be really helpful because our state needs to improve beginning reading instruction. But they also added something that was a little odd. Standard language that has to do with language variation, and they framed it in a way that's a little different. Code meshing as opposed to code switching. Now, it would take me a full half hour to try to explain what those terms mean. So suffice it to say that the way that this was created and put together was a little odd. There were some contradictory terms and things in this, and it was pretty social political or politicized, dominant American English, interrogating notions of which languages are correct. I mean, the intent is really good. I think that overall there's nothing wrong with this, but it's interesting. It's in the public domain, and so we can really talk about it. They do define standardized English, which I think is pretty much the way people are defining that around the United States. But then look at the contradiction. The form of English considered appropriate. Well, to who? So this could be the subject of a whole conference. And what was cited in that was one work, which is a study co-authored by a Dr. Vershawn Ashanti Young, who's a professor at the University of Toronto, I believe. And in the same year, 2020, the National Council Teachers of English published a demand statement co-authored by Dr. Young and 8 other academics, in which they demand Black linguistic justice. And this was really interesting. And when I first saw this, I thought, wow, it's about time, because they're making this really big, important point of how unfair linguistic prejudice is in the United States. Unfortunately, I think there are 9 different specific demands. And in one of the demands or more, they kind of throw out the window the lifelong contributions of some of the Caucasian contributors to a linguistic understanding of this, which I described in the greatest educational story never told. So I think this is both an important statement, and at the same time, I think it's fair to say that NCTE really embarrassed themselves by publishing it in this, with those kinds of hyper social politicization things included. That's just only my own opinion. I had submitted a guest blog to NCTE, National Council Teachers of English, in 2017. To my everlasting astonishment, it didn't come back covered with red ink, but they published it. And I was trying to make kind of the same general point of how undermining linguistic prejudice is to educational outcomes in the United States and to our practice of democracy, because everyone's brain in the United States is pretty much conditioned to think about how people talk in bigoted ways. And this has not been confronted or really adopted. The 50-year study investigation of language in the United States has been so slow to become adopted by the public education field. And so I'm taking the liberty to announce my own linguistic theory, Iowa dialect theory. And it might sound kind of silly, but I'm a native Iowan, and I mean this with all seriousness. So as an education publisher and someone who's worked in this area for 10 years, I have come to believe that almost all print in the United States that gets printed, all texts, so magazines, newspapers, nonfiction books, instruction manuals, almost all of the texts children learn to read with, most fiction, and is written in Iowa dialect. And I'm not talking about academic language, which is subject area matter, specialized vocabulary, that kind of sits on top of dialect in a sense. But based on what we know about how the brain works when the brain's been taught how to read. The brain has to get wired to read. So our brains are automatically associating the spelling patterns in words at lightning speed and associating these words, these which are constructed of these symbol shapes, the letters. And we're automatically associating these words, which are with our visual capability, with the meanings and the pronunciations in the language centers of our brain. So you can't become a fluent reader in the United States as you're taught to read of Iowa dialect. And there's a vast inertia to this. I mean, that's what explains why everything's written in Iowa dialect. It's the inertia of language. But you can't become a fluent reader of Iowa dialect without having to language in Iowa dialect. And this is a huge conundrum. And I'll never know, but it's impossibly unfair. Linguistically, it's a subjugation. It's a linguistic and a cultural subjugation. And most researchers believe that this dialect mismatch makes learning to read and write and teaching children to learn how to read and write even more challenging than those things already are. And I think it's important to really talk about this so that people understand this, so that they can appreciate what a linguistic and cultural subjugation that this is. And so we can appreciate how bigoted our thinking is. Almost everyone's conditioned to think about how different people talk in the United States, and that this could be really key to America becoming less racially bigoted.